My husband stood on stage in front of 500 people and called me nobody. He smiled while he said it, like it was a joke everyone was in on except me. What he didn't know was that every single person in that ballroom depended on my signature for their next paycheck. My name is Vanessa Hart, and this is the story of how I went from invisible to inevitable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation arrived on embossed cardstock, the kind that feels expensive between your fingers. Annual Pinnacle Ventures Leadership Gala, it read in elegant script. Black tie required. Derek had tossed it onto the kitchen counter 3 weeks earlier without so much as a glance in my direction. "You're coming, right?" He'd asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. His eyes were already back on his phone, scrolling through what I assumed were work emails. I picked up the invitation and read it again. Honoring excellence in innovation and strategic growth. There was a small note paperclip to the corner in Derek's assistant's handwriting. "Mr. Hart is receiving the Visionary Leader Award this year. Please confirm attendance for 2." I had confirmed, of course. I always did. For 7 years of marriage, I had shown up to every corporate dinner, every networking mixer, every award ceremony where Derek's face appeared on glossy programs and mine appeared nowhere at all. I had perfected the art of blending into backgrounds, of smiling at the right moments, of laughing when the room laughed even if I hadn't heard the joke. It wasn't that I minded supporting him. I didn't. What wore on me, slowly and quietly like water over stone, was the fact that he never once thought to ask if I wanted to be there. He assumed. And I let him. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of crispness that only Seattle in late October can deliver. The air smelled like rain and fallen leaves, and the sky had gone that deep shade of charcoal that makes city lights look warmer than they are. I spent 2 hours getting ready, not because I particularly cared about impressing anyone, but because I knew Derek would notice if I didn't look the part. I chose a midnight blue gown with clean lines and no embellishments. Simple. Elegant. Forgettable. When I came downstairs, Derek was adjusting his cufflinks in the hallway mirror. He turned, gave me a quick once-over, and nodded. "You look fine," he said. Then he grabbed his keys and headed for the door. The Meridian Hotel stood like a glass and steel monument in the heart of downtown, its lobby glittering with chandeliers that cast fractured light across marble floors. We arrived exactly on time, which for Derek meant 15 minutes late by his internal clock. He preferred to make an entrance. I followed him through the revolving doors, my heels clicking softly against the polished stone. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed into something out of a magazine spread. Round tables dressed in cream linen stretched across the room, each one topped with towering centerpieces of white orchids and flickering candles. A stage had been erected at the far end, flanked by massive projection screens that currently displayed the Pinnacle Ventures logo in sleek silver letters. People milled about in clusters, champagne flutes in hand, laughter rising and falling in waves. I recognized most of them. Directors, senior analysts, a few board members I'd seen in passing at previous events. Derek dove in immediately, shaking hands and clapping shoulders like a politician working a fundraiser. I trailed behind, offering polite smiles to anyone who made eye contact. Most didn't. To them, I was an accessory. The wife. A pleasant blur in the background of Derek's ascent. We found our table near the front, close enough to the stage that I could see the teleprompter screens angled toward the podium. Derek's name was printed on a placard in the center of the table, flanked by names I didn't recognize except for one. Natalie Webb. She was Derek's colleague, someone he mentioned often enough that I'd formed a vague mental image of her before ever meeting her in person. Ambitious, sharp, always 2 steps ahead in meetings. When she arrived at the table 10 minutes later, I realized my mental image had been generous. Natalie was beautiful in the effortless way some people are, with auburn hair swept into a low twist and a dress that probably cost more than my car payment. She greeted Derek with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten, a hand on his arm that lingered just a fraction too long. Then she turned to me, her smile polite but distant. "You must be Vanessa," she said, extending a hand. "I'd heard so much about you." I shook her hand and lied. "Likewise." Derek barely looked at me during the exchange. He was already deep in conversation with the man seated to his right, some vice president whose name I'd forgotten the moment I heard it. Dinner was served in courses, each plate more artfully arranged than the last. I picked at seared scallops and microgreens while the conversations around me swirled like smoke. Everyone talked about growth projections, market disruptions, the next big acquisition. I understood most of it. I'd spent enough time in this world to know the language. But no one asked for my thoughts. No one even looked my way unless they needed me to pass the bread basket. I became what I always became at these events. A warm body filling a seat. The speeches started after dessert. The CEO of Pinnacle Ventures took the stage first, a silver-haired man named Vincent Cole whose voice carried the kind of authority that made people sit up straighter. He talked about the company's vision, its commitment to innovation, the incredible talent that drove its success. Then he began introducing the award recipients. There were several. A woman who'd closed a major deal in Tokyo. A team that had developed some groundbreaking software integration I only half understood. And then, finally, Derek. Vincent's voice swelled with enthusiasm as he described Derek's contributions. Strategic oversight. Market expansion. Visionary leadership. The words sounded impressive, the kind of language that looks good on a plaque. Derek stood and made his way to the stage, his smile wide and easy. The applause was thunderous. I clapped too, my hands moving on autopilot while something cold settled in my chest. He reached the podium, shook Vincent's hand, and accepted a glass trophy that caught the light in sharp angles. "Thank you," Derek began, his voice smooth and confident. "This is truly an honor." He launched into his speech, thanking the executive team, his colleagues, the board. He talked about hard work and perseverance, about taking risks and trusting your instincts. He was good at this. Charismatic. Believable. People hung on his words like they were pearls of wisdom. And then, about halfway through, he paused. His eyes swept the room, and for a moment, I thought he might actually acknowledge me. "My wife is here tonight," he said, and my heart did a stupid, hopeful leap. But then he kept talking. "Vanessa's been a great support. She's always there, you know, in the background. Keeping things running at home so I can focus on what really matters." A few people chuckled. It wasn't a mean laugh, just the kind of polite amusement that fills awkward pauses. But Derek wasn't done. "Someone asked me the other day what she does, and honestly, I didn't really have an answer. She's just, you know, my wife. Nobody important in the business world, but she makes a mean lasagna." The room erupted in laughter. Real laughter this time, the kind that rolls through a crowd and feeds on itself. I sat frozen, my hands still folded in my lap, my face locked in what I hoped looked like a pleasant smile. My ears rang. My throat felt tight. Nobody important. The words echoed in my skull, bouncing off the walls of my mind until they were all I could hear. Derek grinned, clearly pleased with himself, and continued his speech as if he hadn't just publicly reduced me to a punchline. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up and walk out, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to do exactly that. Instead, I sat there, my spine straight, my expression neutral, and waited for the moment to pass. Around me, people returned their attention to the stage. The woman next to me leaned over and whispered, "He's funny." I nodded, because what else could I do? When Derek finally finished and returned to the table, he was riding high on applause and adrenaline. He didn't look at me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just sat down, accepted congratulations from everyone around him, and reached for his wine glass like nothing had happened. Natalie caught my eye from across the table. For a brief second, I thought I saw something there. Sympathy, maybe. Or pity. But then she looked away, and I was alone again. I excused myself quietly, mumbling something about needing the restroom, and slipped away from the table. No one noticed. I walked through the ballroom, past clusters of people still laughing and talking, past waiters clearing plates, past the stage where Derek's face still beamed from the projection screen. The restroom was blessedly empty. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection. My makeup was still perfect. My hair hadn't moved. I looked exactly the same as I had 2 hours ago. But something inside me had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no thunderclap of realization, no sudden surge of rage. It was quieter than that. A door closing. A lock clicking into place. I turned on the faucet and let the cold water run over my hands, trying to ground myself in the sensation. Nobody important. The words played on a loop. I thought about all the years I'd spent standing beside Derek. All the events I'd attended, the hands I'd shaken, the small talk I'd endured. I thought about the way I'd rearranged my life around his career, his ambitions, his schedule. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I thought about the conversations we used to have, back when we first met, when he used to ask about my work, my ideas, my dreams. I couldn't remember the last time he'd asked me anything that wasn't logistical. When's dinner? Did you pick up my dry cleaning? Are you coming to this thing? I dried my hands slowly, deliberately, and looked at myself one more time. Then I walked back out into the hallway. The gala was still in full swing, the noise and energy spilling out of the ballroom in waves. But I didn't go back inside. Not yet. Instead, I found a quiet corner near the coat check and pulled out my phone. I had 3 missed calls. All from the same number. Lawrence Brennan. My late father's former business partner and the closest thing I had to a mentor. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then hit the callback button. He answered on the second ring. Vanessa, he said, his voice gruff but warm. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me. I almost laughed. It came out as something between a breath and a sigh. I could never forget about you, Lawrence. There was a pause, and I could hear him shifting on the other end, probably settling into the old leather chair in his study that creaked every time he moved. You sound off, he said. What happened? I hesitated. The ballroom noise seemed distant now, muffled. Where do I even start? I said quietly. Lawrence had known me since I was 16. He'd watched me grow up, watched me fall in love with Derek, watched me follow him to Seattle and slowly disappear into the role of supportive wife. He'd never said much about it, but I'd always sensed his disapproval. Not of Derek exactly, but of what I'd let myself become. Talk to me, he said now, his tone gentle but firm. So I did. I told him about the speech. About the laughter. About the way Derek had dismissed me in front of 500 people without a second thought. I told him about the years of feeling invisible, of being introduced as just the wife, of watching my own identity shrink until I wasn't sure I recognized myself anymore. Lawrence listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he said, You know you don't have to keep doing this, right? I leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes. I know. Do you? He pressed. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you've forgotten who you are. I didn't answer. He continued, his voice softer now. Your father left you something, Vanessa. Not just money. Power. Influence. A seat at tables most people will never even see. You've been sitting on it for 7 years, letting it collect dust because you thought being a good wife meant making yourself small. But that's not what he wanted for you. And I don't think it's what you want for yourself anymore. He was right. I knew he was right. My father had been a venture capitalist, one of the most respected in the Pacific Northwest. When he died 5 years ago, he'd left me his share of Cascade Capital Group, a private equity firm that funded tech startups and growth stage companies across the region. It was a significant stake. Controlling interest, actually. But I'd let Lawrence manage it, content to remain a silent partner while I focused on being Mrs. Derek Hart. I'd told myself it was temporary. That I'd step in when the time was right. But the time had never felt right. And Derek had never asked. "What are you suggesting?" I asked Lawrence, though I already knew. "I'm suggesting you stop hiding," he said bluntly. "You own 48% of Cascade Capital. Do you know how many companies we've invested in over the past 5 years?" I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. 63. "And do you know which one's been our biggest success story?" I waited. "Pinnacle Ventures," he said, and my blood went cold. "We're their primary investor, Vanessa. Have been since their Series B round. Without our backing, they'd still be operating out of a garage in Fremont." The words hit me like a physical blow. I knew Cascade had a diverse portfolio. I knew we'd made some major plays in the tech sector. But I'd never connected the dots. I'd never thought to ask. Derek worked for a company my family's money had built. And he had no idea. "Does Derek know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lawrence made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I doubt it. Your name's not on any of the public-facing documents. We've kept you out of the press, out of the board meetings. You wanted anonymity. We gave it to you. But that can change." I opened my eyes and stared at the elegant sconces lining the hallway, their soft light casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. "What would that look like?" I asked. Lawrence's voice turned sharp, businesslike. "You attend the next board meeting. You review the financials. You sign off on the quarterly distributions. You remind everyone who actually holds the power. And if Derek has a problem with that, well, he can take it up with the woman who signs his paychecks." Something sparked in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something colder. More deliberate. "When's the next board meeting?" I asked. 2 weeks, he said. "I'll send you the details." I hung up and stood there for a moment, letting the reality of the conversation settle over me like a second skin. Then I straightened my dress, checked my reflection in the darkened window nearby, and walked back into the ballroom. Derek was still at the table, laughing at something Natalie had said. He didn't notice me slip back into my seat. No one did. I picked up my water glass and took a long, slow sip, my mind already 3 steps ahead. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. More speeches. More awards. More champagne. I smiled when expected, nodded at appropriate moments, and played the part I'd perfected over 7 years. But inside, something had shifted. I wasn't the woman who'd walked into this ballroom 3 hours ago. That woman had been willing to accept invisible. This one wasn't. When we finally left, Derek was in high spirits, riding the adrenaline of his award. He talked the entire drive home about the people he'd impressed, the connections he'd made, the opportunities this would open up. I listened in silence, watching the city lights blur past the window. When we got home, he went straight to his office to send follow-up emails, still buzzing with energy. I kicked off my heels in the entryway and walked upstairs to our bedroom. I changed out of the gown and into soft cotton pajamas, hung the dress carefully in the closet, and sat down on the edge of the bed. My phone buzzed. A text from Lawrence. I meant what I said. "It's time." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back a single word. Agreed. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Derek's words over and over. Nobody important. Just my wife. The laughter that had followed. The way he'd smiled, oblivious to what he'd done. By the time the sun started to creep through the curtains, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to confront him. I wasn't going to yell or demand an apology. That would be too easy. Too predictable. Instead, I was going to show him exactly who I was. And I was going to do it in a way he'd never forget. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved quietly. I reached out to Lawrence and asked for access to everything. Financial reports, investment portfolios, board minutes, shareholder agreements. He sent it all without question. I spent hours combing through documents, reacquainting myself with the business my father had built and I'd inherited. I reviewed Cascade Capital's stake in Pinnacle Ventures, and what I found was staggering. We weren't just investors. We were the investors. Our firm held the majority of their preferred shares. We had 2 seats on their board. We had veto power over major decisions. And because of a clause my father had insisted on, any significant financial distribution required sign-off from the majority shareholder. Which was me. I also discovered something else. Derek's promotion 6 months ago, the one he'd celebrated with an expensive dinner and a weekend trip to Vancouver, had come with a hefty stock option package. Options that wouldn't vest unless the company hit certain performance benchmarks and unless key investors approved. Those investors being Cascade Capital. Being me. He'd been walking around for half a year thinking he'd earned his success on merit alone. He had no idea how much of it had been built on a foundation I controlled. I scheduled a meeting with Claire Donovan, Cascade's chief legal counsel and one of the few people who knew the full extent of my involvement. We met at a quiet cafe in Bellevue, away from prying eyes. Claire was in her early 50s, sharp as a tack, with silver-streaked hair she wore in a no-nonsense bob. She slid a folder across the table as soon as I sat down. "This is everything you'll need for the board meeting," she said. "Financials, voting procedures, shareholder rights. I've also included a summary of Pinnacle's current leadership structure and compensation packages." I opened the folder and scanned the contents. Derek's name appeared multiple times. Claire watched me carefully. "You're really doing this?" she asked. I looked up and met her eyes. "He called me nobody, Claire. In front of 500 people." She nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure he understands exactly who you are." We spent the next hour going over strategy. Claire explained the legal nuances, the potential pushback I might face, the importance of appearing calm and prepared. "You can't go in there emotional," she warned. "You need to be cold. Clinical. Let the facts speak for themselves." I assured her I understood. By the time we parted ways, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. The day of the board meeting arrived with a strange clarity. I dressed carefully, choosing a tailored charcoal suit and simple jewelry. Professional. Authoritative. I pulled my hair back into a sleek ponytail and kept my makeup minimal. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I felt different. Solid. Present. Real. Derek had already left for work by the time I came downstairs. He had no idea where I was going. He hadn't asked about my plans in weeks. The board meeting was held in Cascade Capital's downtown offices, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. I arrived 15 minutes early, my heels clicking confidently across the polished concrete floors. Lawrence was waiting for me in the lobby, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "You ready for this?" he asked. I nodded. More than ready. He led me to the conference room where the rest of the board was already gathering. I recognized most of them. Investors, advisors, a few executives from portfolio companies. And sitting near the far end of the table, looking slightly confused, was Vincent Cole. Pinnacle Ventures CEO. The man who'd handed Derek his award 2 weeks ago. Lawrence called the meeting to order and ran through the standard agenda items. Portfolio updates, financial reviews, upcoming investment opportunities. Then he paused and looked directly at me. "Before we move on," he said, "I'd like to formally introduce someone many of you have never met in person. This is Vanessa Hart, majority shareholder of Cascade Capital and primary stakeholder in several of our most successful ventures, including Pinnacle Ventures." The room went very still. Vincent's eyes widened slightly. A few board members exchanged glances. Lawrence continued, his tone even. "Vanessa has decided to take a more active role in company operations moving forward. All major decisions, including executive compensation approvals, will now require her direct sign-off. I stood, my hands resting lightly on the back of my chair. Thank you, Lawrence. I looked around the table, meeting each person's gaze. Some of you may know me as Derek Hart's wife. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because my father built this firm on principles of integrity, accountability, and strategic vision. And I intend to honor that legacy by ensuring every company we invest in reflects those same values. I opened the folder in front of me and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is a summary of pending stock option approvals for Pinnacle Ventures' executive team, I said. Before I sign off on these, I'd like a detailed performance review and a transparent breakdown of how these packages were determined. Vincent shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Hart, he began, but I raised a hand. Ms. Hart, I corrected gently. Or Vanessa, if you prefer. But let's keep this professional. He cleared his throat. Of course. The compensation packages were approved by our internal board and aligned with industry standards. I'm sure they were, I said. But as your primary investor, I have the right to review them before they're finalized. And I intend to exercise that right. The meeting continued for another hour. I asked questions, reviewed documents, and made it abundantly clear that I wasn't just a name on a piece of paper. I was a presence. A force. And I wasn't going anywhere. When the meeting finally adjourned, Lawrence walked me to the elevator. You were brilliant, he said quietly. I felt my shoulders relax slightly. Thank you. He hesitated, then asked, what are you going to tell Derek? I pressed the button for the lobby and watched the numbers light up. Nothing, I said. Not yet. Let him find out the same way he let me find out. Publicly. The days following that board meeting felt different. Not in any dramatic way that someone watching from the outside might notice, but internally, something fundamental had rewired itself. I woke up earlier. My coffee tasted better. The morning light streaming through our bedroom windows seemed sharper, more intentional. Derek continued his routine as if nothing had changed, because for him, nothing had. He left for work at 7:30 each morning, came home around 8 at night, and spent most evenings in his home office responding to emails and taking calls. We existed in parallel lines, close enough to appear connected but never actually touching. I spent my mornings differently now. Instead of scrolling through social media or planning dinners I'd eat alone, I opened my laptop and dove into the world I'd been ignoring. Cascade Capital's investment portfolio was extensive, far more complex than I'd realized. Beyond Pinnacle Ventures, we had stakes in biotechnology startups, sustainable energy projects, artificial intelligence companies working on everything from medical diagnostics to supply chain optimization. My father had been brilliant, strategic in ways I was only beginning to understand. And I'd let all of it sit dormant while I played house with a man who introduced me as nobody. Claire sent me daily briefings. Market analyses, competitor movements, performance metrics for each portfolio company. I absorbed it all hungrily, the way someone dehydrated drinks water. I scheduled calls with division heads, asked pointed questions about quarterly projections, challenged assumptions that hadn't been questioned in years. Some of them seemed surprised. A few seemed threatened. But they all answered, because they understood what Derek apparently didn't. I had authority. Real authority. The kind that didn't require raising your voice or demanding respect. It simply existed, backed by numbers and legal documents and decades of careful relationship building my father had done before me. Lawrence called one afternoon while I was reviewing a pitch deck from a company developing carbon capture technology. You're making waves, he said, and I could hear the approval in his voice. People are talking. Good talking or bad talking? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Both, he admitted. Some of the old guard think you're overstepping. They preferred when you were invisible. But the younger partners, the ones who actually understand where the industry's heading, they're relieved. They've been waiting for someone to shake things up. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window at the gray Seattle sky. And Vincent Cole? What's he saying? Lawrence chuckled, a dry sound that suggested he found the whole situation amusing. Vincent's scrambling. He knows you have the power to block executive compensation, and he knows Derek's package is caught in that freeze. He's been trying to reach you directly. Has he? I asked mildly. I'd seen the missed calls, the emails with subject lines like important discussion needed and request for meeting. I'd ignored all of them. Let him scramble for a bit longer, Lawrence suggested. Make him understand that your time is valuable. That you're not just going to rubber stamp whatever he puts in front of you. I smiled. That was exactly what I'd been planning. Derek came home late that Thursday, later than usual. I was in the living room reading a legal analysis of shareholder voting rights when he walked in, his tie loosened and his jacket slung over one shoulder. He looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that comes from stress rather than physical exertion. He dropped his briefcase by the door with a heavy thud and headed straight for the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator open, the clink of a beer bottle, the hiss of the cap being twisted off. Then he appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. Rough day? I asked, not looking up from my reading. He took a long pull from his beer. You have no idea. Vincent's been in a mood all week. Something about investor relations and approval processes. It's a mess. I kept my expression neutral, turned a page. That sounds frustrating. He moved into the room and collapsed onto the couch across from me. It's more than frustrating. It's ridiculous. We've got stock options that were supposed to vest last month, and now everything's frozen because some investor nobody's ever heard of suddenly wants to micromanage every decision. He laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Like they know anything about running a company. I looked up then, met his eyes over the top of my book. Maybe they know more than you think. Derek waved a dismissive hand. Doubtful. These investor types, they just sit back and collect checks while people like me do the actual work. They have no idea what it takes to build something. I set my book down slowly, deliberately. You think investors don't contribute anything? He shrugged. I think they contribute money. Which is important, sure. But the real value, the real innovation, that comes from people on the ground. People making decisions, taking risks, leading teams. I nodded as if considering his point. And what happens when those people making decisions forget where the money came from? When they start thinking they built something entirely on their own? Derek took another sip of his beer, clearly not registering the edge in my tone. Then they prove everyone right. That they were the ones who mattered all along. I picked up my book again, mostly to avoid letting him see my face. Interesting perspective, I said quietly. He stayed on the couch for another 10 minutes, venting about work politics and board interference and investors who didn't understand the tech industry. I let him talk, offering non-committal sounds of agreement when appropriate. Eventually he stood, kissed the top of my head absently, and disappeared upstairs to shower. I sat alone in the living room for a long time after that, my book forgotten in my lap. The casual arrogance in his voice, the absolute certainty that he'd earned everything himself, that investors were just background noise in his success story. It crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't quite articulated. Derek didn't just dismiss me. He dismissed everyone who didn't fit his narrative of self-made achievement. And he had no idea he was talking about his own wife. The weekend arrived with rain, the kind of persistent drizzle that turns Seattle into a study in gray. Derek spent most of Saturday at the office, something about a product launch that needed his direct oversight. I used the time to meet with Patrick Reyes, the attorney who'd handled my father's estate and had been quietly managing the legal intricacies of my Cascade Capital stake. We met at his office in Pioneer Square, a renovated brick building that still had the original wood floors and exposed beams from its early 1900s construction. Patrick was in his mid-60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a meticulous way of speaking that made every word feel considered. He'd known my father for 30 years, had been present at my parents' wedding, had attended my college graduation. When I walked into his office that morning, he stood and embraced me like family. "It's good to see you taking charge, Vanessa," he said. Your father would be proud. We sat across from each other in worn leather chairs that had probably been in this office longer than I'd been alive. I need your advice, I said. Not just legal advice. Strategic advice. He folded his hands and waited. I told him about the gala. About Derek's speech, the laughter, the casual cruelty of being reduced to a punchline. I told him about the board meeting, about stepping into my role at Cascade, about the realization that I'd been holding all the cards without ever knowing the game being played. Patrick listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to happen?" "That's the question I keep asking myself," I admitted. Part of me wants Derek to understand what he did. To see me as an actual person with value and capabilities. But another part of me knows that's not really possible. You can't force someone to respect you. You can only decide whether or not you're willing to accept their disrespect. Patrick nodded slowly. So the real question is what you're willing to accept going forward. Exactly. He stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. In my experience, people like Derek don't change because they suddenly develop empathy. They change because the consequences of their behavior become impossible to ignore. You have leverage now. The question is how you want to use it. I joined him at the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street below. People hurried past with umbrellas, heads down, focused on getting where they needed to go. I don't want revenge, I said. That's not what this is about. But I do want accountability. I want him to understand that actions have consequences. That you can't build a life on someone else's foundation and then act like they don't exist. Patrick turned to face me. Then let's talk about what accountability looks like in practical terms. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out a plan. Patrick explained the full extent of my authority within Cascade Capital, the decisions I could make unilaterally, the approvals I could withhold. He walked me through the corporate governance structure at Pinnacle Ventures, showing me exactly where my influence intersected with Derek's career trajectory. It was more extensive than I'd realized. His promotion, his stock options, even his position on certain strategic projects, all of it required investor approval at various stages. And I was the investor who mattered most. But Patrick also cautioned me. You need to be strategic about this, he said. If you come down too hard, too publicly, it could backfire. People might see you as vindictive rather than principled. You need to establish yourself as a serious investor making sound business decisions, not as a wife settling scores. I understood what he meant. The optics mattered. I couldn't just freeze Derek's compensation because he'd humiliated me. I needed legitimate business reasons. Performance concerns. Governance issues. Strategic misalignment. Fortunately, as I dug deeper into Pinnacle's operations, those concerns weren't hard to find. The company had been growing fast, maybe too fast. They'd made several acquisitions in the past 18 months that weren't integrating well. Customer retention numbers were slipping. Employee turnover in key departments was higher than industry standards. And the executive team, Derek included, had been focused more on expansion metrics than operational stability. None of it was catastrophic, but it was concerning. The kind of concerning that justified a major investor pressing pause and demanding answers. I left Patrick's office with a clear plan. First, I would request a comprehensive operational review of Pinnacle Ventures. Not just financials, but culture metrics, integration progress, customer satisfaction data. Second, I would attend their next quarterly business review in person. And third, would make it clear that executive compensation, including Derek's stock options, would remain frozen until I was satisfied the company was on solid footing. All of it was defensible. All of it was smart business. And all of it would force Derek to contend with a reality he'd been conveniently ignoring. That night, Derek came home in a better mood. The product launch had apparently gone well, and he was riding the high of positive feedback. He suggested we order takeout and watch a movie, something we hadn't done in months. I agreed, mostly because refusing would have seemed strange. We settled on Thai food and a thriller neither of us had seen. Halfway through the movie, my phone buzzed. An email from Claire with the subject line "Operational Review Request Submitted." I glanced at it quickly, then set my phone face down on the couch. Derek noticed. "Work stuff?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. He laughed. "You and your mysterious projects. One of these days you'll have to tell me what you actually do with all your free time." I looked at him, sitting there with his arms stretched across the back of the couch, completely relaxed, completely oblivious. "Maybe one day I will," I said. "But probably not the way you're expecting." He smiled, thinking I was joking, and turned his attention back to the movie. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything feel possible. I dressed carefully again, choosing a deep navy dress and a structured blazer. Professional but not severe. Confident but not aggressive. I had a full day ahead. A meeting with Cascade's investment committee, a call with one of our biotech portfolio companies, and then, in the afternoon, a video conference with Vincent Cole. He'd finally managed to get on my calendar, after 3 weeks of trying. The meeting with Vincent was scheduled for 2 o'clock. I set up in the small home office Derek rarely used, making sure the background was clean and professional. A bookshelf, a piece of abstract art, nothing distracting. When the video call connected, Vincent appeared on screen looking significantly less polished than he had at the gala. His tie was slightly crooked, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Vanessa, thank you for making time," he said, and I could hear the careful diplomacy in his voice. "Of course," I replied evenly. "I understand you wanted to discuss the operational review." He shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes. I have to admit, the request caught us off guard. We weren't expecting this level of scrutiny from Cascade. We've had a strong working relationship for years." "We still do," I said. "But strong relationships require transparency and accountability. My father believed in being an active partner to the companies we invest in, not just a passive check writer. I intend to honor that philosophy." Vincent nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely pleased. "Of course. And we're happy to provide whatever information you need. But I want to be candid with you. This freeze on executive compensation is creating some internal tension. People are starting to ask questions." "Good," I said simply. "They should be asking questions." Vincent blinked. "I'm sorry." I leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact through the camera. A healthy organization is one where people ask questions. Where they're curious about how decisions are made and who's accountable for results. If your executive team is uncomfortable with scrutiny, that tells me they've gotten too comfortable operating without it. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I understand your point. But some of our top performers are considering other opportunities because of this uncertainty. Derek especially has been fielded multiple offers from competitors." I kept my expression carefully neutral. "Then perhaps Derek should take one of those offers if he feels undervalued here." Vincent's eyes widened slightly. "You're not concerned about losing key talent?" "I am very concerned about retaining talent that deserves to be retained," I said. "But retention should be based on performance and alignment with company values, not on appeasing egos or rewarding people simply because they threaten to leave." The rest of the conversation was tense but professional. Vincent tried several different angles to convince me to expedite the approval process. I remained polite but unmoved. By the time we ended the call, it was clear he understood the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. He wasn't dealing with a rubber stamp anymore. He was dealing with someone who would hold him and his executive team accountable. After the call ended, I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. My hands were trembling slightly, adrenaline coursing through my system. Not from nervousness, but from the sheer intensity of finally using my voice in a space that mattered. For years, I'd been silent. Accommodating. Deferential. And it had gotten me nowhere. This felt different. This felt like power, not the loud, aggressive kind that demands attention, but the quiet, steady kind that doesn't need to. That evening, Derek came home even later than usual. When he walked through the door, his energy was different. Not tired, but agitated. He barely acknowledged me before heading straight to his office and closing the door. I heard him on the phone, his voice rising and falling in frustrated cadences. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Something had rattled him. An hour later, he emerged and found me in the kitchen, where I was preparing a simple dinner of pasta and salad. "We need to talk," he said, and there was an edge to his voice I rarely heard. I turned off the burner and faced him. "Okay. What's going on?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he only made when genuinely stressed. "This investor situation at work is getting out of hand. Whoever this person is, they're blocking everything. Vincent's scrambling, the board's freaking out, and nobody knows how to handle it because apparently this investor has been completely hands-off for years and suddenly they want to control everything." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "That does sound stressful." Derek paced the length of the kitchen. "It's more than stressful. It's sabotage. My stock options are frozen. Projects I'm leading are being questioned. I've got recruiters calling me every day with offers that would pay 20% more, and I can't even seriously consider them because I'd be walking away from equity that's supposed to vest, but now who knows if it ever will." "Why do you think the investor is doing this?" I asked carefully. He threw his hands up. "Who knows? Maybe they're trying to tank the company. Maybe they're incompetent. Maybe they just enjoy making people's lives difficult. Vincent thinks it's some kind of power play, like they're trying to assert dominance or prove they're still relevant." I tilted my head slightly. "Or maybe they're doing their job. Making sure the company they've invested millions in is actually well managed and sustainable." Derek stopped pacing and looked at me. "Whose side are you on?" I straightened. "I'm not on anyone's side. I'm just saying that maybe there's a legitimate reason for the scrutiny. If the investor has concerns about operations or leadership, shouldn't those be addressed?" He shook his head. "You don't understand how business works, Vanessa. Investors are supposed to invest and then get out of the way. Let the people who actually know what they're doing run things. When they start micromanaging, it kills innovation and drives away talent." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "You really believe that? That investors have nothing valuable to contribute beyond money?" "Absolutely," he said. "The best investors are the ones you never hear from. They write the check, show up for the annual meeting, and collect their returns. Anything more than that is just interference." I turned back to the stove, resuming my cooking because I didn't trust my face to remain neutral. "That's an interesting perspective," I said quietly. Too quietly. Derek didn't notice. He continued ranting for another 10 minutes. About entitled investors, about people who've never built anything, telling others how to do their jobs, about the arrogance of thinking that owning shares meant understanding an industry. I let him talk, stirring pasta sauce with mechanical precision. When he finally wound down, he sighed heavily. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to unload all that on you. You probably have no idea what I'm talking about." I turned off the heat and faced him again. "You'd be surprised what I understand." He smiled, that familiar patronizing smile I'd seen 1,000 times. "I know you try to follow what I do. I appreciate that. But this stuff is pretty complex." I nodded slowly. "You're right. It is complex. Which is probably why investors who actually know what they're doing take it so seriously." Derek laughed, completely missing the point. "If only this investor knew what they were doing. Then we wouldn't be in this mess." He kissed my forehead absently and grabbed a beer from the fridge. "Thanks for listening. You're good at that." Then he disappeared back into his office, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen with dinner half prepared and a decision fully formed. I wasn't going to tell him. Not yet. Not directly. He would find out eventually, but it would be on my terms, in the way that would make the most impact. Because Derek was right about one thing. I was good at listening. I'd been listening for 7 years. Listening to how little he valued me. Listening to how thoroughly he dismissed my potential. Listening to him build an entire worldview based on the premise that I was simply nobody important. Well, he was about to discover exactly how wrong he'd been. And when that moment came, I wouldn't have to say a word. The facts would speak for themselves. The operational review took 3 weeks to compile. Claire coordinated with Pinnacle's CFO, requesting everything from detailed financial statements to employee satisfaction surveys to customer churn analysis. Some of the data came willingly. Some required formal requests invoking our investor rights. By the time the full report landed on my desk, it was over 200 pages of dense information, charts, and appendices. I read every single page. What I found was enlightening. Pinnacle Ventures was profitable, but barely. Their rapid expansion had stretched resources thin. Customer acquisition costs were rising while customer lifetime value was declining. 3 of their recent acquisitions were hemorrhaging money. Employee reviews on sites like Glassdoor mentioned a toxic culture at leadership levels, favoritism, lack of transparency, and a general sense that executives were more interested in personal glory than company health. Several mentions specifically called out individual leaders who took credit for team efforts. Derek's name appeared twice. I scheduled another call with Vincent, this time with Claire present. "We need to discuss the operational review findings," I said when he answered. Vincent looked even more tired than last time. "I've seen the preliminary summary," he admitted. "Some of the numbers aren't great. Some of the numbers are concerning," I corrected. "And the cultural indicators suggest deeper problems than just quarterly performance fluctuations. We need to have a serious conversation about leadership effectiveness and strategic direction." Vincent sighed. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that executive compensation remains frozen until we see demonstrable improvement in 3 key areas: customer retention, employee satisfaction, and integration success for recent acquisitions. I'm also proposing that we bring in an outside consultant to assess leadership dynamics and provide recommendations for improvement. And finally, I'm proposing that I take a more active role in quarterly oversight. Not micromanaging, but ensuring accountability." There was a long pause. Vincent looked off camera, probably at someone else in the room. "That's a significant level of involvement." "Yes," I said. "That's what active investing looks like." He rubbed his temples. "Some of the executive team won't react well to this." "That's not my concern," I said evenly. "My concern is protecting Cascade's investment and ensuring Pinnacle is positioned for sustainable success. If members of the executive team can't handle accountability and transparency, perhaps they're not the right leaders for this stage of the company's growth." Vincent met my eyes through the screen. "You're talking about Derek, aren't you?" I held his gaze. "I'm talking about anyone whose performance doesn't align with what this company needs. If Derek's one of those people, then yes, we need to address that. But this isn't personal, Vincent. This is business." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me, but I kept my expression professionally detached. After the call ended, Claire turned to me with something that might have been admiration. "You just effectively put Derek's entire career on review without him knowing it came from you." I closed my laptop slowly. "He'll know eventually. But by then, it won't matter. The decisions will already be made based on data and performance, not on relationships or politics." Claire smiled. "Your father would have handled it exactly the same way." That night, I made a decision. I pulled out my phone and composed a message to Lawrence. "I'm ready for the next board meeting. I want to present the Pinnacle findings myself and propose the new oversight structure. Can you make that happen?" His response came within minutes. "Already on the agenda. You present in 2 weeks. Prepare to answer tough questions. Some board members will push back on this level of intervention." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I'm ready." The preparation consumed me in a way I hadn't expected. Every evening after Derek left for work and every morning before he woke, I buried myself in research. Financial statements became my bedtime reading. Market analyses replaced the novels that used to sit on my nightstand. I memorized growth trajectories, studied competitor strategies, and learned the language of quarterly projections until I could speak it fluently. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. It had evolved into something larger, something that felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. Claire sent me practice questions, the kind of aggressive challenges I might face from skeptical board members. She played devil's advocate over video calls, pushing back on every proposal, questioning every assumption. Why now? Why this level of intervention? What makes you think you're qualified to make these assessments? The questions stung at first, touching nerves I didn't know were exposed. But with each session, my answers became sharper, more confident. I learned to separate emotion from strategy, to present my case not as a wronged wife seeking vindication but as a shrewd investor protecting her assets. Lawrence called 3 days before the board meeting with a warning. "Victor Ashford is going to come at you hard," he said, referring to one of the longest-serving board members, a man who'd made his fortune in commercial real estate and had very traditional views about how businesses should operate. "He thinks you're overreaching. He's been making calls, trying to build opposition to your proposals." "Let him," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "His opposition doesn't change the facts. The data supports everything I'm recommending." Lawrence was quiet for a moment. "You sound different," he finally said. "More focused." "I am focused," I replied. "For the first time in a long time, I know exactly what I'm doing and why it matters." He made a sound that might have been approval. "Good. Because you're going to need that clarity. This won't be easy." "I know," I said. But neither was sitting in that ballroom listening to my husband tell 500 people I was nobody. At least this time, I'm fighting back. When we hung up, I stood at the window of my home office, watching rain streak down the glass. The city stretched out below, lights beginning to flicker on as evening approached. Somewhere out there, Derek was in a meeting, probably complaining about investor interference, completely unaware that the interference he resented so much was coming from the woman who shared his bed. The irony should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt sad. Not sad enough to stop, but sad nonetheless. We'd started so differently. I could still remember the early days, when Derek would ask about my ideas, when he seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about business and strategy. My father had still been alive then, and Derek had been almost deferential, recognizing that I came from a world he was trying to break into. But as his career advanced and my father's health declined, something shifted. The questions stopped. The interest faded. And by the time my father died, I'd already become what I was now, an accessory to Derek's ambition rather than a partner in building something together. The morning of the board meeting arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of brilliant autumn day that makes Seattle feel almost Mediterranean. I dressed in a charcoal suit with subtle pinstripes, paired with a silk blouse the color of deep wine. Professional but not austere. Authoritative without being aggressive. I pulled my hair back in a low twist and kept my jewelry minimal, just small diamond studs my father had given me for my 30th birthday and my wedding band. I stared at that ring for a long moment before leaving, twisting it around my finger. It felt heavier than it used to. The Cascade Capital offices occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in the financial district. I'd been here before, of course, but always as a visitor, someone passing through to sign documents or attend perfunctory meetings where my presence was noted but not required. Today felt different. The security guard in the lobby greeted me by name. The elevator attendant asked which floor without me having to specify. People knew I was coming. People had been talking. Lawrence met me on the executive floor, his expression serious but encouraging. "They're already gathering in the main conference room," he said. "Full attendance. Even Victor flew in from San Francisco for this." "Of course he did," I said. "He wants to watch me fail." Lawrence's mouth quirked slightly. "Then let's make sure he's disappointed." We walked down a corridor lined with photographs of successful exits, companies that Cascade had invested in early and later sold for significant returns. My father appeared in several of these photos, always slightly off to the side, never demanding center stage but unmistakably present. I touched one of the frames as we passed, a brief connection to the man who'd built all this and trusted me to carry it forward. The conference room was exactly as intimidating as I'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Elliott Bay, where ferries crawled across gray-blue water like patient insects. A massive table dominated the center, surrounded by leather chairs that had probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. 12 board members were already seated, some reviewing documents, others engaged in quiet conversations that stopped when I entered. Victor Ashford sat at the far end, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression carefully neutral. He nodded at me once, a gesture that acknowledged my presence without offering warmth. I took my seat near Lawrence, opened my laptop, and distributed printed copies of my presentation. The room settled into an expectant silence. Lawrence called the meeting to order, ran through standard procedural items, and then turned to me. Vanessa has requested time to present findings regarding Pinnacle Ventures and proposed changes to our oversight structure. The floor is yours. I stood, not because I needed to but because it felt right. Command of physical space often translates to command of attention. Thank you all for making time for this discussion, I began. I know many of you have questions about my recent involvement with portfolio operations, particularly regarding Pinnacle Ventures. Today I hope to address those questions and explain why I believe stronger oversight is not just warranted but essential. I advanced to the first slide, a simple chart showing Pinnacle's revenue growth over 5 years. On the surface, this looks like a success story, I continued. Steady growth, market expansion, increasing valuation. But surface metrics rarely tell the complete story. I walked them through the data methodically. Customer acquisition costs rising faster than revenue. Integration failures in 3 recent acquisitions resulting in write-downs totaling $42 million. Employee turnover in critical departments exceeding 30%, nearly double the industry average. Customer satisfaction scores declining for 6 consecutive quarters. Each point was backed by documentation, charts, third-party analyses. I'd learned from Claire that the key to persuasion wasn't volume but precision. Every claim needed proof. Every assertion needed support. Victor interrupted halfway through. With all due respect, he said, and I noted how people always preface disrespect with those words, these kinds of growing pains are normal for a rapidly scaling company. If we pull back now, we risk stifling the very innovation that made Pinnacle attractive in the first place. I nodded, acknowledging his point. You're absolutely right that growing pains are normal. But there's a difference between normal friction and systemic dysfunction. I advanced to a new slide, this one showing comparative data. Here's Pinnacle's performance metrics next to 3 comparable companies at similar growth stages. Notice anything? The room leaned forward collectively. Pinnacle's numbers were consistently worse across every category. Higher costs, lower retention, more integration challenges. One board member, a woman named Teresa Hoffman who'd made her fortune in biotech, spoke up. This is concerning. Why haven't we seen this analysis before? Because nobody was looking, I said simply. We've been relying on quarterly reports from Pinnacle's executive team, reports that emphasize positive metrics while downplaying or omitting problematic ones. It wasn't until I requested a comprehensive operational review that these patterns became visible. Victor tried again. So you're suggesting the executive team has been misleading us? I'm suggesting that executive teams naturally emphasize their successes and minimize their challenges. That's human nature. Which is exactly why active oversight matters. We can't rely solely on self-reported metrics from the people whose compensation depends on those metrics looking good. Another board member, someone I didn't know well, asked the question I'd been waiting for. What specifically are you proposing we do about this? I outlined my recommendations clearly. First, maintain the freeze on executive compensation until we see measurable improvement in customer retention, employee satisfaction, and integration success. Second, engage an independent consultant to assess leadership effectiveness and organizational culture. Third, implement quarterly reviews where I or another board representative meets directly with department heads, not just C-suite executives, to understand ground-level operations. And fourth, revise our governance agreement with Pinnacle to include more robust reporting requirements and oversight mechanisms. The room erupted in overlapping questions and objections. How long would compensation remain frozen? Wouldn't this level of oversight damage our relationship with Pinnacle's leadership? What if key executives left rather than submit to increased scrutiny? I fielded each question calmly, drawing on the hours of preparation Claire and I had done. Yes, some executives might leave. But if they're leaving because they can't handle accountability, are those the leaders we want steering a company we've invested $70 million in? The compensation freeze would lift as soon as we saw sustained improvement, likely within 2 quarters if leadership took the concern seriously. And our relationship with Pinnacle's leadership was already damaged by their underperformance. Better to repair it through honest assessment than to let it deteriorate further through neglect. Victor pushed back harder. This seems personal, he said, and the room went very still. You've been largely absent from operations for years, and suddenly you want to implement the most aggressive oversight structure we've ever had with a portfolio company. It's reasonable to question the motivation. I met his eyes steadily. You're right that the timing raises questions. So let me address them directly. Yes, my increased involvement is recent. And yes, there are personal factors that motivated me to finally step into the role I've always had the right and responsibility to fill. But none of that changes the validity of the data I'm presenting or the soundness of the recommendations I'm making. I paused, letting that sink in. If anyone in this room can show me where my analysis is flawed or my proposals are unreasonable, I'm eager to hear it. But if the only objection is that I haven't been active enough in the past, well, I'm correcting that now. Shouldn't we focus on whether I'm right rather than on why I finally decided to engage? Teresa spoke up again. I think Vanessa's point stands. These metrics are troubling regardless of what prompted us to examine them. And frankly, I'm more concerned about why we weren't seeing these patterns earlier than about why Vanessa is seeing them now. The discussion continued for another hour. Some board members supported my proposals enthusiastically, grateful that someone was finally asking hard questions. Others remained skeptical but couldn't effectively argue against the data. Victor continued to resist, but even he seemed to recognize that pure opposition without alternative proposals was a losing strategy. Eventually, Lawrence called for a vote. The oversight structure passed 9-3. The compensation freeze was approved 10-2. The independent assessment was unanimous once I agreed to let the board collectively choose the consultant rather than selecting one myself. When the meeting finally adjourned, I felt drained but steady. Lawrence caught my eye across the table and gave a small nod of approval. Several board members came up to shake my hand, offering congratulations or asking follow-up questions. Teresa lingered after the others had left. That was impressive, she said quietly. Victor's not used to being outmaneuvered, especially by someone he's dismissed as a passive stakeholder. I closed my laptop carefully. I wasn't trying to outmaneuver anyone. I was trying to do the right thing. She smiled. That's what made it effective. When you lead with data and principle rather than politics, it's much harder to oppose you. I left the office building and walked for a while, needing to move after sitting for so long. The city felt different somehow, more solid under my feet. I found myself at Pike Place Market, wandering past flower vendors and fish throwers and tourists taking photographs. The sensory overload was grounding. Smells of fresh bread and roasting coffee. Sounds of vendors calling out prices and street musicians playing for tips. The ordinary commerce of daily life, far removed from conference rooms and corporate battles. My phone buzzed. A text from Claire. Heard the vote went through. Well done. Then another message. Vincent Cole wants to schedule a call. I assume he's heard about the board decision. I stared at that second message. Of course Vincent had heard. Board decisions at that level weren't secrets. He'd know by now that the compensation freeze was officially ratified, that independent consultants would be assessing his leadership team, that quarterly oversight was coming whether he liked it or not. And he'd know that I was the driving force behind all of it. I texted back. Schedule it for tomorrow. I want time to prepare. Claire responded immediately. Already did. 3 p.m. And Vanessa, she added, he's going to push for information about your motivation. Be ready for that. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and kept walking. My motivation. As if having a financial stake in a company's success wasn't motivation enough. As if wanting accountability and transparency was somehow suspicious. But I knew what they were really asking. They wanted to know if this was about Derek. If I was using my position to punish my husband for humiliating me. The honest answer was complicated. Yes, Derek's speech had been the catalyst. Yes, realizing that I had power I'd been ignoring had given me the courage to finally use it. But was I proposing these changes solely to hurt him? No. Because the data didn't lie. Pinnacle's problems were real, and they needed addressing regardless of my personal situation. If Derek was a strong leader who could handle scrutiny and accountability, these changes would ultimately benefit him. If he wasn't, well, that was information the company needed to know regardless of his relationship to me. I bought a bouquet of dahlias from a vendor, bright orange and yellow blooms that looked like condensed sunshine. The vendor, an older woman with kind eyes, smiled as she wrapped them. Special occasion? She asked. Something like that, I said. She handed me the flowers. Whatever it is, I hope it brings you joy. I thanked her and continued walking, cradling the blooms like something precious. Joy felt like too simple a word for what I was experiencing. It was more complex than that. Relief, maybe. Purpose. The satisfaction of finally using capacities I'd let atrophy for too long. By the time I made it home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Derek's car wasn't in the driveway. I let myself in, arranged the dahlias in a vase, and stood in the kitchen listening to the silence. This house had always felt like Derek's space, filled with his choices, his furniture, his vision of what our life should look like. I'd accommodated myself to it so thoroughly that I'd forgotten to have opinions about where I lived. Another thing that needed to change. Derek came home near midnight, long after I'd gone to bed. I heard him moving around downstairs, heard the refrigerator open and close, heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs. He came into the bedroom without turning on the light, undressed in the darkness, and slipped under the covers. I kept my breathing even, pretending to be asleep. He settled in without touching me, and within minutes his breathing deepened into sleep. I lay awake for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange disconnection of sharing a bed with someone who felt like a stranger. The next morning, Derek was gone before I woke. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Working late tonight. Don't wait up. The note was in his handwriting but felt impersonal, like something you'd leave for a housekeeper rather than a wife. I crumpled it and tossed it in the recycling bin. Then I made coffee and settled into my office to prepare for the call with Vincent. At 3 o'clock precisely, my laptop chimed with the incoming video call. Vincent appeared on screen looking significantly worse than our last conversation. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled. The confident executive I'd seen at the gala was nowhere in evidence. Vanessa, he began, thank you for making time. I've just come from a rather difficult board meeting where I learned about Cascade's new oversight requirements. I nodded. I imagined that was an uncomfortable conversation. Uncomfortable is one way to put it, he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice. I'm trying to understand what changed. We've had a strong partnership for years. Cascade has been hands-off, trusting us to execute our vision. And now suddenly there's talk of frozen compensation, independent consultants, quarterly reviews. It feels like we're being put on probation. You are being put on probation, I said evenly. Because the operational review revealed serious concerns that need addressing. Vincent leaned forward. But why now? What prompted this level of scrutiny after years of letting us operate independently? I considered how to answer that. The truth was complicated, but Vincent deserved honesty, at least to a point. I've been a passive investor, I said carefully. That was a mistake on my part. I inherited a significant responsibility when my father died, and instead of stepping into it, I let others manage it while I focused on other things. But passive investing doesn't serve anyone well. Not the investors, not the companies we invest in, and not the employees and customers who depend on those companies being well run. Vincent absorbed that. So this isn't personal? It's not about any individual, I said, which was technically true even if it sidestepped the fuller story. It's about ensuring that companies in our portfolio are operationally sound and positioned for sustainable success. If that scrutiny makes some people uncomfortable, that's unfortunate but necessary. He rubbed his face tiredly. Derek is convinced you have some kind of vendetta against Pinnacle. That you're trying to undermine the company for reasons no one understands. My stomach tightened. What do you think? I asked. Vincent met my eyes through the screen. Honestly? I think you're doing your job. Maybe for the first time, but you're doing it. And I think the concerns you've raised are legitimate, even if I wish they'd been brought to my attention differently. But I also think you need to understand the position this puts me in. I have an executive team that's already stretched thin, and now they're looking over their shoulders waiting for the other shoe to drop. That kind of uncertainty kills productivity and drives away talent. So what are you proposing? I asked. Give us a clear path forward, he said. Specific benchmarks we need to hit, concrete timelines for when the compensation freeze will lift, transparency about what the independent assessment will cover. If we're going to be under a microscope, at least let us know exactly what you're looking for. That's fair, I said. I'll work with my team to develop clear performance metrics and timelines. But Vincent, you need to understand something. This isn't a negotiation about whether oversight happens. It's already happening. The only question is whether your team chooses to see it as an obstacle or an opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities. He nodded slowly. I hear you. And for what it's worth, I do think this will ultimately make us stronger. It's just going to be a painful transition. Most worthwhile transitions are, I said. We ended the call cordially, professionally. But as the screen went dark, I sat back and let out a long breath. Vincent had mentioned Derek specifically. Derek was convinced I had a vendetta. Which meant Derek knew, or at least suspected, that the investor causing all his problems was someone with personal knowledge of Pinnacle's operations. He just hadn't connected the dots yet. But he would. Eventually, inevitably, he would figure it out. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my college roommate, Andrea, who now lived in Portland with her wife and 2 kids. We'd drifted apart over the years, the natural entropy of lives moving in different directions. But when she answered, her voice was exactly as I remembered. Warm, immediate, present. Vanessa Hart, she said, drawing out my name like an accusation. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten my number. I almost did, I admitted. It's been too long. We talked for over an hour. I told her about the gala, about Derek's speech, about everything that had unfolded since. Andrea listened the way she always had, without judgment, letting me work through my thoughts out loud. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you remember senior year when you were deciding whether to go straight into business school or take that fellowship in London?" I remembered. I'd agonized over that decision for months. You told me something I've never forgotten, Andrea continued. You said that the scariest decisions are usually the ones that lead somewhere worth going. That fear is often just a sign that something actually matters. I closed my eyes, remembering that conversation, remembering who I'd been then. Someone unafraid of taking risks. Someone who believed in her own capabilities. What happened to that person? I asked quietly. Life happened, Andrea said gently. Love happened. And sometimes we make ourselves smaller to fit into spaces that were never big enough for us in the first place. But that person you used to be? She's still there, Vanessa. You're proving it right now. We hung up shortly after, but her words stayed with me. That person you used to be is still there. I went to the guest room that night, the one we'd always said would eventually become a nursery but had remained empty, a repository for boxes we'd never unpacked and furniture we didn't know what to do with. I cleared some space and sat on the bed, looking around at the neutral walls and generic decor. This room could be anything, I thought. An office. A studio. A space entirely my own. Not a nursery waiting for children Derek and I had stopped discussing years ago. Not storage for a life we weren't actually living. Just a room with potential. I fell asleep there, in the guest bed, surrounded by possibility. And when morning came and Derek knocked softly on the door, confused about why I wasn't in our bedroom, I told him the truth. I needed space to think, I said. He looked hurt but didn't press. Okay, he said slowly. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, I lied. I just didn't sleep well. He accepted that and left for work, leaving me alone with the decision I'd been avoiding. How much longer could I maintain this pretense? How much longer did I want to? The independent consultant arrived 2 weeks later, a woman named Dr. Helena Marsh who specialized in organizational psychology and corporate culture assessment. She had silver hair cut in a sharp bob and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every corporate excuse and believed none of them. I met her at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill before her first day at Pinnacle, wanting to establish rapport before she walked into what I knew would be a hostile environment. Thank you for taking this on, I said as we settled into a corner booth. I know Pinnacle wasn't expecting this level of scrutiny. Helena stirred her black coffee slowly. In my experience, the companies that resist scrutiny most fiercely are the ones that need it most desperately. She pulled out a tablet and opened a document. I've reviewed the operational data you provided. The patterns are consistent with what I call executive isolation syndrome. Leadership becomes so insulated from ground-level reality that they start making decisions based on wishful thinking rather than actual conditions. How long does an assessment like this typically take? I asked. She considered. Thorough assessments require 6 to 8 weeks. I'll conduct confidential interviews with employees at all levels, observe leadership interactions, review internal communications, analyze decision-making processes. By the end, you'll have a clear picture of not just what's broken but why it broke and how to fix it. And the employees you interview, I said carefully, their confidentiality will be protected? Absolutely, Helena said firmly. If people think their honest feedback will be traced back to them, you get nothing useful. I guarantee complete anonymity. That matters to me, I said. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about understanding what's actually happening so we can make informed decisions. Helena studied me for a moment. Most people say that but don't mean it. I think you actually do. I met her gaze. I spent 7 years being invisible in my own life. I know what it feels like when nobody asks your opinion or values your perspective. I don't want to perpetuate that, even in a business context. She smiled slightly. Then we'll get along just fine. Helena started her work at Pinnacle the following Monday. I wasn't there, deliberately choosing to let her establish her presence without me hovering. But Claire kept me updated through daily summaries. Day 1, employees were suspicious and guarded. Day 2, a few brave souls began opening up. By day 5, Helena reported that people were actually seeking her out, wanting to share their experiences. The floodgates had opened. Derek's behavior at home grew increasingly erratic. He'd come home late, pour himself bourbon instead of beer, and sit in brooding silence while scrolling through his phone. When he did talk, it was to complain about the consultant, about invasive questions, about employees who didn't understand that leadership required making tough decisions that wouldn't always be popular. I listened without commenting, playing the role of supportive wife while internally cataloging everything he said. One night, about 3 weeks into Helena's assessment, Derek came home and actually looked at me, really looked, for the first time in weeks. We need to talk, he said, and something in his tone made my pulse quicken. I set down the book I'd been reading. All right. He sat on the couch across from me, his posture tense. This situation at work is getting worse. The consultant is interviewing everyone, asking questions about leadership style and decision-making and culture. Some people are clearly using it as an opportunity to air grievances or settle scores. What kind of grievances? I asked neutrally. Derek waved a hand dismissively. The usual complaints. People who feel overlooked for promotions, people who think they should have more input on strategy, people who are just naturally negative. But it's creating this toxic atmosphere where everyone's second-guessing everything. And the executive team, we're basically paralyzed because we know anything we do might be criticized in one of these interviews. Have you considered that maybe the grievances are legitimate? I asked carefully. He looked at me sharply. What do you mean? I mean that if multiple people are raising similar concerns, perhaps there's substance to them. Maybe instead of viewing this as people settling scores, you could see it as an opportunity to understand perspectives you haven't been exposed to. Derek stood abruptly. You sound like the consultant. I'm serious, Vanessa. This whole thing feels orchestrated. Like someone with a grudge is trying to take down the leadership team. My heart hammered, but I kept my voice level. Who would have that kind of grudge and that kind of power? He paced the length of the living room. That's what I keep trying to figure out. Vincent's being cagey about who pushed for this assessment. All he'll say is that it came from a major investor who has concerns about operational effectiveness. But we have multiple major investors. Why is this one suddenly so involved? Maybe they've always cared, I suggested. Maybe they just finally decided to act on their concerns. Derek stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sometimes I wonder if you actually listen when I talk about work. This isn't normal investor behavior. Normal investors care about returns. They don't care about employee satisfaction surveys or leadership style assessments. This is personal. Someone is trying to hurt us. Or help you, I said quietly. Maybe someone thinks that honest feedback and accountability will ultimately make the company stronger. He stared at me. Whose side are you on? I'm not on anyone's side, I said, standing to face him. I'm just suggesting that maybe, just maybe, there's value in listening to what people are saying instead of automatically assuming it's all malicious. He shook his head slowly. You really don't understand how business works. This isn't about listening. It's about maintaining authority and credibility. Once you let people question your decisions openly, you've lost control. And without control, you can't lead effectively. Something in me snapped. Then maybe you shouldn't be leading. The words were out before I could stop them, hanging in the air between us like smoke. Derek's face went pale, then flushed red. What did you just say? I took a breath, steadying myself. I said maybe you shouldn't be leading. If your entire leadership philosophy is based on control and avoiding accountability, if you see employee feedback as a threat rather than valuable information, then perhaps you're not the right person for the role you're in. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek stared at me as if I'd transformed into someone he didn't recognize. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but you're way out of line. You have no idea what it takes to run a company, to manage people, to make decisions that affect hundreds of employees and millions of dollars. You've never worked in a corporate environment. You've never had to answer to a board or meet quarterly targets or deal with investor pressure. So maybe you should keep your opinions about my leadership to yourself. I could have backed down then. The old Vanessa would have apologized, smoothed things over, retreated into silence. But I wasn't that person anymore. You're right, I said quietly. I haven't worked in a corporate environment the way you have. But I've spent 7 years watching you, listening to you, learning how you think about business and leadership. And I've learned that sometimes the people closest to a situation are the least able to see it clearly. Derek grabbed his keys from the side table. I'm going for a drive. I need to clear my head. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with controlled force. I stood in the empty living room, my hands trembling slightly, and realized I'd just crossed a line we couldn't uncross. The pretense of supportive, understanding wife had cracked wide open. From here, Things would only escalate. I called Claire. "It's starting to fall apart," I said when she answered. "Tell me," she replied simply. So I did. I told her about the conversation, about Derek's mounting paranoia, about the thin ice our marriage was skating on. When I finished, Claire was quiet for a moment. "You know he's going to figure it out eventually," she said. "The timing's too convenient. Major investor suddenly becomes active right after his wife gets publicly humiliated. He'll connect those dots." "I know," I said. "Part of me thinks he already has and just doesn't want to believe it." "What do you want to happen?" Claire asked, echoing Patrick's question from weeks ago. "I want him to understand what he did," I said. "I want him to feel what it felt like to be dismissed and devalued. But more than that, I want him to see that his way of leading, his way of treating people, has consequences. Not just for me but for everyone who works under him." Claire made a thoughtful sound. "Helena's preliminary findings come out next week. Based on what I've heard, they're not going to be favorable for Derek. Are you prepared for what happens when those findings become official?" I looked around the living room, at the life Derek and I had built together, the carefully curated furniture and art that reflected his taste more than mine, the space that had never quite felt like home. "As prepared as I can be," I said. Claire's voice softened. "You're going to need support through this. Not just legal and financial support. Emotional support. Do you have people you can lean on?" I thought about Andrea in Portland, about the few friendships I'd let atrophy over years of focusing on Derek's career and social circle. "I'm working on rebuilding that," I admitted. "Good," Claire said. "Because this is about to get very difficult." Helena's preliminary report arrived on a Wednesday morning via encrypted email. The executive summary alone was damning. Systematic pattern of leadership favoritism. Lack of transparent decision-making processes. Multiple reports of credit appropriation where senior leaders took credit for work done by subordinate teams. Toxic competitiveness at executive level undermining collaborative culture. High performers leaving due to lack of recognition and growth opportunities. The detailed findings were even worse, pages of anonymized quotes from employees describing an environment where speaking up was discouraged, where executives operated in silos, where strategic decisions were made without input from the people who'd have to implement them. Derek was mentioned by name in 17 separate contexts. Employees described him as charismatic but inconsistent, someone who could be warm and engaging one day and coldly dismissive the next. Multiple people mentioned his tendency to present others' ideas as his own. One quote stood out. "When you work for Derek Hart, you learn quickly that your job is to make him look good. Your actual contributions don't matter as much as your ability to reflect well on him. If you can't do that, you're invisible." I read that quote 3 times, feeling the bitter recognition of my own experience reflected in someone else's words. This was how Derek operated. Not just with me but with everyone. He built his success by surrounding himself with talented people and then absorbing their accomplishments while keeping them in the background. I'd thought my experience was unique, personal. But it was systematic. A pattern of behavior that extended far beyond our marriage. Lawrence called that afternoon. "I assume you've seen Helena's preliminary findings." "I have," I said. "It's worse than I expected." He sighed. "Vincent's seen them too. He's in crisis mode. The board's calling an emergency meeting to discuss next steps." "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow. 2:00. And Vanessa," Lawrence's voice grew serious, "Victor Ashford is demanding your presence. He wants to question you directly about your role in all this and whether you had prior knowledge of these issues." "Of course he does," I said. "He's looking for a reason to dismiss the findings. If he can paint me as a vindictive wife with an axe to grind, he can undermine Helena's credibility." "Exactly," Lawrence said. "Which is why you need to be absolutely clear about your motivations and your timeline. When did you first suspect problems at Pinnacle? When did you decide to push for an assessment? How much did your personal relationship with Derek influence your decisions?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The honest answers to those questions are complicated. Then we need to find ways to make them simple, Lawrence said. Because Victor's going to try to make this about your marriage instead of about legitimate business concerns. Don't give him that opening. We spent the next hour strategizing, crafting responses that were truthful but focused, that acknowledged my personal connection without letting it overshadow the substance of Helena's findings. By the time we hung up, I felt prepared but exhausted. The emotional labor of constantly defending my right to take up space, to have authority, to demand accountability, it was wearing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Derek didn't come home that night. He sent a text around 11 saying he was staying at a hotel because he needed time to think. I stared at the message for a long time before responding with a simple okay. Part of me wanted to ask if he was all right, if we could talk. But a larger part recognized that we were past the point where talking would help. We'd reached the stage where only truth mattered, and truth was coming whether either of us was ready for it. The emergency board meeting felt different from the last one. The energy was charged, almost electric with tension. Victor Ashford sat at the head of the table, his expression severe. Helena sat to one side with her laptop open, looking calm and professional. Vincent Cole participated via video conference, his face drawn and tired. And I sat next to Lawrence, my spine straight, my hands folded on the table, projecting a confidence I didn't entirely feel. Victor called the meeting to order and got straight to the point. We've all reviewed Dr. Marsh's preliminary findings. They raise serious concerns about leadership and culture at Pinnacle Ventures. Before we discuss remediation strategies, I want to address the elephant in the room. He looked directly at me. Vanessa, your husband is mentioned extensively in this report. You pushed for this assessment. Some might argue that your personal relationship creates a conflict of interest that undermines the validity of these findings. I met his gaze steadily. Some might argue that. But the data doesn't lie. Dr. Marsh conducted confidential interviews with over 60 employees. Those employees didn't know about my relationship to Derek. They didn't know I was the investor pushing for oversight. They shared their experiences honestly because they were assured of anonymity and protection. The patterns that emerged weren't planted or manufactured. They're the reality of working at Pinnacle Ventures. Victor leaned forward. But you had to know that examining your husband's company would reveal unflattering information about him. How can we trust that you weren't looking for ammunition to use against him personally? I could have gotten defensive. I could have taken the bait. Instead, I stayed calm. You're right that I knew examining Pinnacle closely might reveal problems with Derek's leadership. But that's not why I pushed for this assessment. I pushed for it because operational data showed systematic issues that threatened our investment. The fact that my husband happens to be part of those issues doesn't make the issues less real or less concerning. Teresa Hoffman spoke up. I think we're losing sight of what matters here. We have documented evidence of cultural problems that are driving away talent and undermining performance. Whether Vanessa's marriage influenced her timing is less relevant than whether her concerns were justified. And based on what I'm seeing, they absolutely were. Another board member chimed in. I agree with Teresa. We can debate motivation all day, but at the end of the day, we hired an independent consultant who found serious problems. We need to focus on fixing those problems, not on attacking the person who brought them to light. The discussion shifted then, moving away from questioning my motives toward actually addressing Helena's findings. We spent 2 hours reviewing the data, asking Helena clarifying questions, debating potential interventions. By the end, we'd agreed on a set of recommendations. Mandatory leadership training for all executives. Implementation of 360-degree feedback processes. Creation of clearer pathways for employee advancement and recognition. And most significantly, performance reviews for all C-suite executives, including specific improvement plans for those identified as problematic. Derek's name appeared on that list. So did 3 other executives. Vincent, participating via video, looked like he might be sick. This is going to cause significant disruption, he said quietly. Some of these people might leave rather than go through performance improvement plans. Then they leave, Teresa said firmly. We're not in the business of protecting egos. We're in the business of building sustainable, successful companies. If executives can't handle accountability, they're not the leaders we need. The meeting adjourned with clear action items and timelines. Helena would complete her full assessment and provide detailed recommendations. Vincent would implement the agreed-upon changes within 60 days. And I would participate in quarterly reviews to monitor progress. As people filed out, Victor approached me. His expression was less hostile than before, more thoughtful. "That was well handled," he said grudgingly. "You didn't let me rattle you." "Thank you," I said carefully. He nodded once. "I still think your timing was suspect. But I can't argue with the substance of what you've uncovered." "That's all I ever wanted," I replied. "For the substance to be taken seriously." I drove home in a daze, the afternoon sunlight feeling surreal after hours in that windowless conference room. My phone buzzed repeatedly. Texts from Claire congratulating me on how I'd handled Victor. A message from Patrick asking for a debrief. An email from Lawrence with formal notes from the meeting. And then, finally, a text from Derek. "We need to talk. Tonight. I'll be home by 7. My stomach nodded. This was it. The conversation we'd been circling for weeks was finally here. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing, not with notes or talking points but with quiet reflection. What did I want to say? What did I need him to understand? And critically, what was I willing to accept and what wasn't I? Derek arrived at 7:15, his tie still knotted tight, his briefcase gripped in one hand. He set it down in the entryway with deliberate care and turned to face me. "I know," he said. Those two words hung between us. I felt my breathing go shallow. "Know what? Don't play games, Vanessa. I know you're the investor. I know you're the one who pushed for the assessment, who froze compensation, who's been micromanaging Pinnacle for the past 2 months. Vincent finally confirmed it this afternoon." I nodded slowly, my heart hammering but my voice steady. "You're right. It's me." Derek laughed, but it was a harsh, broken sound. "My own wife. Sabotaging my career. Using your family's money to punish me because I made some stupid joke at a gala. That's what this is, isn't it? Revenge." I shook my head. "It's not revenge, Derek. It's accountability. There's a difference." "Accountability?" He spat the word. "You've been lying to me for months. Pretending to be supportive while actively working to undermine everything I've built. And you call that accountability?" "I didn't lie," I said firmly. "I just stopped telling you everything. There's a difference. And what you've built, Derek, you built it on other people's work. On other people's ideas. On a foundation provided by investors you never acknowledged or respected. Including me." He stared at me like I was a stranger. "I loved you. I gave you everything. A home, stability, a life most people would be grateful for. And this is how you repay me? By destroying my career?" "I didn't destroy anything," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You did that yourself. Every time you dismissed someone's contribution, every time you took credit for work you didn't do, every time you prioritized your ego over your team's well-being. I just finally held up a mirror and forced you to look at what you'd become." Derek's face twisted with anger and something that might have been pain. "You had no right." "I had every right," I said. "I'm a major investor in a company that's underperforming because of leadership problems. That's not personal. That's business." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Don't pretend this is just business. You wanted to hurt me. After all this time, after everything we've been through, you wanted to make me feel small the way you felt small. And congratulations, Vanessa. You succeeded." I felt tears threaten but forced them back. "If that's what you think, you still don't understand. This was never about making you feel small. It was about refusing to stay small myself. It was about finally using the power and resources I've always had but was too afraid or too accommodating to use. You told 500 people I was nobody. And instead of falling apart, I proved you wrong. That's not revenge. That's self-respect. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we'd never said, with years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding and missed opportunities to actually see each other. Finally, Derek spoke, his voice tired. I can't stay here tonight. Maybe not for a while. I need to figure out what happens next. With work, with us, with everything. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He grabbed his briefcase and a few things from upstairs, moving through the house like he was already a ghost in it. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, he said without looking at me, I'm sorry. About the speech. About making you feel invisible. I never meant to hurt you that way. I know you didn't, I said quietly. That's almost worse. That you could do it without even realizing. He left then, the door closing with a finality that felt like punctuation. I stood alone in the house that had never quite felt like mine and let myself cry. Not because I regretted what I'd done. But because endings always hurt, even necessary ones. Even endings that lead somewhere better. 4 months passed like water finding its level, reshaping everything in its path. Derek moved out permanently, taking only what he'd brought into the marriage. The divorce papers were filed quietly, handled by attorneys who kept everything civil and professional. He accepted a position at a competitor, a lateral move that paid well but lacked the prestige he'd enjoyed at Pinnacle. We spoke only through lawyers, which felt appropriate. We'd spent years not really talking anyway. Pinnacle underwent its transformation slowly but visibly. Vincent implemented every recommendation from Helena's assessment. 2 executives besides Derek chose to leave rather than participate in performance improvement plans. The remaining leadership team, now supplemented by internal promotions of talented people who'd been overlooked, began rebuilding the culture with intention. Customer retention improved. Employee satisfaction scores climbed. The integration challenges with acquired companies started resolving as people felt empowered to speak honestly about problems. I attended quarterly reviews as promised, but my role evolved beyond oversight. Vincent started seeking my input on strategic decisions, valuing the perspective I brought as someone who saw patterns across multiple companies. Other portfolio companies in Cascades Holdings began requesting similar engagement. Apparently, word had spread about the investor who actually cared about operational health, not just financial returns. Lawrence pulled me aside after one particularly productive board meeting. Your father would be proud, he said. Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've done it. With integrity and care. I felt the weight of those words. My father had built his reputation on being the kind of investor who made companies better, not just more profitable. I was finally honoring that legacy in my own way. The house felt different without Derek, larger somehow despite having fewer people in it. I renovated the guest room into a proper office, painted the walls a warm gray, installed built-in bookshelves that I filled with business books and journals. I hosted my first dinner party in years, inviting Claire and Patrick and Teresa Hoffman, along with Andrea who drove up from Portland. We talked about work and life and everything in between, and I realized how long it had been since I'd had conversations that felt genuine rather than performative. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email. It was from Natalie Webb, Derek's former colleague from the gala. She'd left Pinnacle shortly after Derek did, accepting a role at a startup. Her message was brief but striking. I wanted to reach out and say thank you. What you did took courage. A lot of us knew things weren't right but felt powerless to change them. You showed us that accountability was possible. I hope you're doing well. I read that email 3 times before responding. Thank you for reaching out. I hope you're thriving in your new role. We exchanged a few more messages, tentative bridges built between 2 women who'd both been underestimated in different ways. It felt like completion of something, though I couldn't quite name what. 6 months after Derek left, I did something I'd been considering for weeks. I established a fund within Cascade Capital specifically focused on investing in companies founded or led by women who'd been overlooked by traditional venture capital. Not out of charity, but because I'd learned firsthand how much talent gets wasted when people make assumptions about who deserves opportunities. The fund would be small initially, but it would be mine to direct, my own way of ensuring others didn't have to fight as hard as I had to be taken seriously. The launch event was modest, held in a renovated warehouse space in Georgetown that reminded me of possibility rather than polish. About 50 people attended, mostly entrepreneurs and other investors who understood what we were building. I gave a short speech, something I would have been terrified to do a year ago but that now felt natural. "We're not here to disrupt for disruption's sake," I said. "We're here to invest in people who've been told they're nobody and give them the resources to prove everyone wrong." Afterward, a young woman approached me nervously. She had a pitch deck for a healthcare technology company tucked under her arm. "I've been trying to get funding for 2 years," she said. "Everyone says the idea is interesting but they're not sure I'm the right person to execute it." I looked at her, seeing my own reflection in her determination mixed with doubt. "Tell me about your idea," I said. "And don't undersell yourself. If you've kept going for 2 years despite rejection, that tells me everything I need to know about your ability to execute." We talked for 20 minutes. Her idea was solid, her passion evident. I gave her Claire's card and told her to set up a formal pitch meeting. She left looking like someone had finally seen her, really seen her, and I understood that feeling completely. That night, driving home through Seattle streets glittering with rain and reflected light, I thought about the woman I'd been at that gala. The one who sat silently while her husband called her nobody. The one who'd spent years making herself small enough to fit into someone else's vision of what she should be. That woman felt like a character from someone else's story now, someone I'd known but no longer was. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The house was mine now, fully and completely. I'd bought out Derek's share in the divorce settlement. Every room reflected choices I'd made, colors I loved, furniture that felt comfortable rather than impressive. It was smaller than the life I'd had before, but it was bigger in every way that mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Andrea. "Proud of you, little sister. Keep changing the world." I smiled and typed back. "One investment at a time." Inside, I kicked off my shoes and made tea, settling into the chair by the window that overlooked the garden I'd started planting last month. Tomorrow I had 3 pitch meetings and a board call. Next week, the fund's first investment would close. The month after, I'd be keynoting a conference about active investing and corporate accountability. But tonight, I just sat in the quiet of my own space, in a life I'd built deliberately rather than defaulted into, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, though there was that too. Something deeper. Presence. The sense of occupying my own life fully, of being seen and heard and valued, starting with how I saw and heard and valued myself. They'd called me nobody. I'd proven I was somebody. But the real victory wasn't in proving anything to them. It was in finally believing it myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.